Okay, just like to say good evening to everyone and welcome you to tonight's webinar on the transition cows and the importance of trace elements to them. On behalf of Agrimin, I work as the area sales manager for Northern Ireland and the border counties, and we're very pleased tonight to have Annie Williams, our company animal scientist and current European sales manager, with us. Annie, by way of introduction, qualified with her degree in bioveterinary science at the University of Liverpool. She followed this up with her master's in animal nutrition at the University of Nottingham, and her final piece of study was a PhD in mineral bioavailability at Harbour Adams. So Annie literally eats, sleeps and breathes elements and minerals in all aspects of ruminant. So we're pleased to have Annie with us tonight. It wasn't originally our plan to deliver this presentation live, but I think with a straw poll of practices and participants or potential participants, it was felt in the current COVID situation that was more responsible to deliver the presentation online, just so that no one was adversely affected by an outbreak of COVID if we'd been unfortunate. So at this stage, I'd just like to thank you all for tuning in. At this stage, the format would be, we'll go straight into Annie's presentation. You're all very welcome to post questions as and when you feel fit in the course of the presentation, and we'll answer those then at the end, if that's okay. But feel free to actually answer or ask that question at any stage through the presentation. So I'll hand over to Annie at this stage, and hopefully you'll enjoy what you're about to hear. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart. So thanks for joining us tonight, everybody. As Stuart said, I'm going to talk predominantly about transition cows and about trace elements, but we will talk a little bit about calves, and there is the opportunity to ask questions on beef, sheep at the end of the presentation. If you do have a question during the presentation, please type it in the Q&A box, and we'll do our very best to get through as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Thank you, everybody. So, transition cows and trace elements is what we're going to focus on. So we're going to talk about why trace elements are actually important during transition. So in that, I'm going to cover 4 main areas that are associated with potential trace element problems, or problems that can be associated with a low trace element status. So these are problems surrounding calving. So that could be anything from retained placentas to poor calf health. I'm going to talk a little bit about maternal transfer of trace elements. So getting those trace elements into the calf that are needed for calf health, and that being maternal transfer via the placenta, but also maternal transfer via colostrum and via milk. I'm going to talk a little bit about how trace elements then affect the fertility of the cow going forward. So if we don't get the trace element status of those animals right during transition, during that dry period, during calving, going forward into that early lactation, that can have a knock-on effect on the cow's fertility going forward into our next lactation. So we'll touch on that and touch on the trace elements that are most important in that sort of scenario. And then also briefly have a look at performance in the next lactation. So directly linking it with calving problems, metabolic diseases, energy utilization of the ration, and show you all the important areas where it's really important that we are getting this trace element status correct. You'll hear me refer during the presentation a few times to optimizing trace element status. So we're not trying to take cows higher and higher and higher in terms of their trace elements in their blood or their trace elements in the liver. What I want to see is trace element status being in the normal range, where the cow is not being limited in terms of her performance or her health by a shortfall of trace elements in her diet. So I'm going to focus on 2 main trace elements, and that's going to be iodine and selenium. I will briefly touch on a few others, but if you do have questions about others that I'm not going to mention so much, so things like copper, manganese, then please feel free to ask us questions on those at the end. So I'm going to touch on the trace elements that are most commonly found in shortfall in transition cows in the UK and across Ireland. So starting with iodine. So iodine is absolutely vital for the development of the thyroid gland and production of thyroid hormone. And therefore, thyroid hormones control energy metabolism. That lower iodine therefore results in poor metabolism. Now, when we're talking transition cows, where iodine is really important is actually for the developing calf. So if you think that a calf is doing 70% of its fetal growth during that final trimester, it's also increasing its iodine content in the body. So at birth, a calf will have 5 times as much iodine circulating as the cow does. So that iodine has got to be circulating in the calf, otherwise we get these weak, dopey, floppy calves that don't want to get off the ground. You're trying to get them to suck at 2 o'clock in the morning and they've just got no interest. That can be an indication that the iodine status of the cow during that dry period, during that final stage of pregnancy, was not high enough for her to pass on enough iodine for that developing calf to function optimally at birth. So that's one of the trace elements that we commonly find in shortfall and presents as classic clinical signs at calving. The other one commonly found in shortfall is selenium. Now, selenium's a little bit more complicated because not only is it also linked with iodine, it controls a lot of different physiological processes in the body. It's involved in lots of different enzymes within those processes, and therefore a shortfall of selenium can present in lots of different ways. So with iodine, we tend to get this classic weak, floppy calf syndrome, which we put down to iodine. We must make sure that if we're putting it down to iodine, that we have actually checked what the selenium status of those cows is, because the pathway of taking iodine from the blood and putting it into a thyroid hormone, so in its entry to the thyroid to be converted to a thyroid hormone, part of the process of that involves selenium. So if the cow doesn't have enough selenium circulating in her body, she may also present with an iodine shortfall, but that iodine shortfall is actually caused by selenium. Aside from that, selenium has its own roles in the body as part of different enzymes. I mean, the most common one being glutathione peroxidase, and that's often the one that we'll measure to look at selenium status of a cow. But because of its involvement in lots of enzymes, selenium is important for lots of different reasons. So really important for muscle development. So where we're talking transition cows, where we're talking calves, we want those calves to be born with adequate selenium to start growing, to start thriving, to start developing their muscles. So we need to get maternal transfer of selenium during that dry period, during the transition of that cow. It's also really important in correct liver function. So where we've got the liver as the powerhouse of the body, removing toxins, helping the cow to cope under stress, which, let's face it, transition is a really stressful time for the cow. We want that liver to be functioning at its optimum, and we can only do that if we've got the absolute optimum selenium status. So like I say, there's that word again, optimum. I'm not saying that we should be taking these cows higher and higher and higher in terms of their selenium status. What I'm saying is that we need to put them in the normal range to allow them to perform at their genetic potential and make sure they're not being held back by a low selenium status. We've also got selenium functioning as an antioxidant. Again, that's going to tie in with this liver function, with this removal of toxins from the body, with this cow being as healthy as possible during transition. Also really important for those reasons and others for the immune system. So for the cows and the calves' ability to cope with disease, to respond to disease. And then if we take it forward and we go through this transition period, we go forward hopefully into a healthy, profitable, productive lactation, selenium is also really important for fertility and getting these cows back in calf. So it's performing lots of different roles in the body, one not more important than the other, but showing you sort of a range of roles that are happening all the time, but when the cows come under stress at transition, might be magnified, gives us an idea of how important these trace elements can be. So iodine, selenium, copper, manganese, zinc, with a focus in this presentation on the two most commonly found in shortfall, which are iodine and selenium. So what kind of problems can we see if we don't get this trace element status right? So if we go back to the first slide, where we said we're going to look at calving problems, maternal transfer, performance in the next lactation, fertility, this is the slide just giving you some examples on what sort of calving problems that we can expect to see if we don't absolutely optimize that cow's trace element status. So we see selenium status being strongly linked with incidence of retained placentas. So there's lots of research that's gone on in the dairy industry. You'll be able to find lots of published papers which show that the link between the selenium status of the animal and the incidence of retained placentas. So we really want to get that right during transition to avoid those retained placentas and avoid the problems that that causes going forward. There's also papers showing that selenium status has a direct effect on the incidence of mastitis. So this is going back to selenium's involvement in enzymes which are antioxidant, in proteins that are part of the immune system, showing that we can have that direct effect on incidence of mastitis. And we need to make sure that the animal is of optimum selenium status to lower that incidence of mastitis and have it as low as possible in that herd of animals, obviously depending on lots of other factors that also affect mastitis, things that are going on in the environment. And then the other one that I mentioned when I was talking about iodine is this weak and floppy calf syndrome. So that's probably sort of if we think that we're in January now, almost February, going forward into spring calving, that is probably the most common phone call that I get is calves being born weak, floppy. We've still got 100, 200 cows to calve. What can we do about it? Is it too late? How can I increase their iodine status? And that's a tricky one, because we need to maintain their iodine status throughout the dry period and throughout transition. But what I say to farmers in that situation is it's never too late to try and get more iodine into them, because it will only improve the situation. It won't make it worse, but it may not fully resolve it because you may be too late to get enough iodine into those calves to get them all off the floor and not being so weak and floppy. And then what I would advise is that the farmer then sort of looks at his regime in terms of what has gone wrong. Why have we not got enough iodine into these dry cows this year? And what can we do next year to avoid that problem? So iodine being really important in late pregnancy for the calf's health. So maternal transfer of trace elements is really important. And like I say, we can be talking about maternal transfer via colostrum, via milk, or we can talk about maternal transfer during pregnancy via the placenta. but whichever we're talking about, it's really important that we give the calf the opportunity to be born with an optimized trace element status so that it has the best start in life. So for selenium, for example, supplementing with selenium, so in the form of sodium selenite, has been shown to increase selenium concentrations in the blood and liver of calves at birth. So that shows us that we are definitely getting a maternal transfer of that selenium from the cow to the calf to enable it to have a higher selenium status when it's born. And given all the needs of selenium, so all the reasons why an animal needs selenium, all those physiological processes in the body, all those enzymes, all those things linked to the immune system, that gives the calf the best opportunity to perform and to be healthy at birth. And then iodine. So iodine can move either via the placenta or via milk. It moves really well via both. So maternal transfer happens via both routes, obviously depending on how long we keep that calf on the cow for. So the fetal thyroid gland from day 53 of gestation basically takes iodine in, so that the iodine is readily transferred from the cow to the calf at that point. But it's a steady increase basically in how much iodine is being transferred to the calf. So at the end of the gestation, the iodine circulating in the calf is approximately 5 times that of the cow, and the amniotic fluid serves as a reservoir of iodine for the fetus. And there has been a little bit of work done that shows that if you really don't supply enough iodine during the dry period, during the end of pregnancy, that the cow will actually sacrifice the iodine circulating in her own blood to pass it on via maternal transfer to her calf at her own detriment for the reasons that she needs iodine in her blood. And one that we've not mentioned, but is really important in terms of maternal transfer, is copper. So maternal transfer of copper to the calf is really important for normal development of the nervous system, the skeleton, and metabolism. And if we don't get adequate maternal transfer of copper, we get impaired fetal growth. If that impaired fetal growth is excessive, then death can result. Now, copper isn't one I've massively mentioned because obviously there is herds where it's hugely over-supplemented. So we get extremes of copper, we get shortfalls, we get toxicities, we get somewhere in between, and we're always aiming for that sweet spot of optimizing copper status. So controlling how much copper is in the liver of the animal so that it can homeostatically control how much copper is in the liver, in the blood, that is converted to enzymes to allow that animal to function properly, to allow it to transfer copper to the calf for the calf's nervous system, skeleton, and metabolism development. So going forward into the lactation, so we have hopefully taken the cow through the dry period, she's had a successful calving. We can also relate trace elements to what happens going forward into that early lactation. So one of the things that we're obviously then looking at is that cow's fertility. We want to get her back in calf and start the cycle again next year. So in terms of how do we link fertility to the cow's trace element status, and particularly to the 2 trace elements I've mentioned, iodine and selenium, is in a couple of different ways. So detection of estrus is reported to be harder in cows whose thyroid is not functioning optimally. So if a cow doesn't have a thyroid that's functioning optimally, one of the reasons that can be is a direct link to that cow's iodine status. So how much iodine is circulating in her blood that is available to go into the thyroid. And then what it means basically by detection of estrus is harder is she just doesn't show it. She doesn't show the signs of estrus So if you were walking the cows, you would see less cows bulling if there was a thyroid hormone issue. So it's harder to detect. We can also look at reproductive parameters that are linked to iodine. So in Holstein cows, a study showed that for every 1 microgram percentage, I know that's a very strange unit, but that's the unit that was used in the paper, increase in plasma-bound iodine, there was a decrease in the service interval of 7.8 days, a decrease in the interval of breeding to conception of 7.4 days, and a decrease of 0.2 services per conception. So there will come a point at which that increase no longer makes any difference. But what we're talking about is making sure that iodine is not a limiting factor to that animal's fertility. So if we put her iodine into the blood in the normal range, allow her thyroid to function optimally, if we've got a long service interval or a high number of services per conception, we know that isn't linked to our iodine status. We've done everything that we can to optimize that, but we need to look at something else for why those reproductive parameters are not where we want them to be. And then the other way that we can link the trace elements that we've talked about to fertility is things like looking at incidence of metritis and ovarian cysts, which again can be directly linked with the cow's selenium status. So one interesting bit of work that's been done on selenium recently is looking at where the dry cows are being underfed. So you've probably seen quite a lot in the vet press, in the farming press, about the overfeeding of copper, particularly copper to high-performing dairy cows, getting copper from lots of different sources. But this study that was actually done via a survey for a PhD student at Harper Adams looked at a few different minerals and whether they're being underfed, overfed, oversupplied in the diet. But the result that really stood out to me was that 86% of dry cows are being underfed selenium if you take the recommended feeding level in the UK to be 0.3 milligrams per kilogram dry matter. So the survey that they did, which I think it was somewhere between 50 and 60 cows, found that the average amount being fed to dry cows in all year round calving systems was 0.09 milligrams per kilogram dry matter. Now, if we think back to the slides that we've done and all the functions that selenium has, not only during transition, but also throughout the lactation, that's going to have a big effect on the performance of these animals. So yeah, that was some interesting research. I mean, it was fairly localized. So like I say, it was UK, but it was kind of 50 farms within the sort of West Midlands, Wales region. And it would be interesting to see that work done sort of with a bigger geographical spread. But that was a result that kind of stood out to me. So what does a farmer actually want from transition? So an easy, simple solution that provides the farmers with a peace of mind. So something that is going to supply them with the trace elements they need to optimize the trace element status of these cows. And like I say, put them into the normal range and rule out that it's trace elements that are causing the problem. So what would be ideal is a low maintenance supplementation method so that the farmer doesn't have to monitor the cows daily. I mean, we know, and I'm sure you guys visit like a range of farms that run completely different systems, but quite often dry cows are not checked daily, or feed is certainly not pushed up daily. Whereas if we can find a method of supplementation where the animal doesn't need to be monitored daily, then we still know that their trace element status is okay. So we want to reduce possible calving diseases, production diseases, prepare the cow for successful, profitable lactation, and optimize her fertility. So look at aiding the cow holding at first service. So what we're going to obviously suggest is a bolus. And this is the bolus that I would suggest for the majority of transition cows across the UK. So this is the all trace high iodine bolus, and it's an eroding bolus technology. So this is our new segmented technology, which we have a really good control over the release rate of the bolus. So this bolus lasts for 6 months. It provides the animal with iodine, selenium, cobalt, zinc, manganese, copper, and vitamins. And it provides those for 6 months. So we take this animal through the dry period, all the way through into her next lactation, which is again that point where we want that animal to be fertile, and takes her through that. Hopefully she's then back in calf because we've optimized her trace element status. So I would recommend that cows are bolused at drying off, and that sees the animal through for the next 6 months, even if there's fluctuations in the feed, even if feed is not pushed up daily, even if the feed being put in front of her is of fairly low quality, she's still being provided with the trace elements she needs, both as a dry cow and as a lactating cow. So there's a few trace elements that I haven't mentioned in terms of their importance that are in that bolus. I just thought I'd add a quick slide on those trace elements, why they're there, and if you've got any questions on them, like I say, please type them in the Q&A box. So manganese, zinc, cobalt, and vitamins, probably the trace elements that we talk about the least in terms of dairy cows compared with iodine, selenium, copper, but all have really important functions. And in fact, I actually started working at Agrimin 10 years ago, and I've gone off, done my degree, master's, PhD in between, and come back. But I've been back full time about 2.5 years now. And a few years ago, I would never have got any questions on manganese. It just wasn't mentioned. People didn't see it as a problem. Now I probably get 4 or 5 phone calls a year with people diagnosing different things or having calves with abnormalities. And I think I go forward and go, that's definitely manganese that's caused that problem. So I think we are starting to see manganese have more effects, particularly probably in these high performing herds. So manganese really important for the skeletal development of the calf during pregnancy. Otherwise, we see calves being born with things like short bones in the legs, or joint problems, or jaw problems that can be a little bit more subtle, but all indicate that there was not enough manganese present during pregnancy. So we've also got zinc, cobalt, vitamins, and all of these things together, including manganese, are part of the body's antioxidant defense. So they're part of enzymes involved in that defense, removing toxins from the body, aiding the body's immune response and resilience to disease. It's always important to remember that vitamins are lower generally in conserved forages than they are in fresh grass. So if we've got animals for extended periods of time on conserved forages, it's always worth considering what that's going to do in terms of, are they getting minerals? And these trace elements and vitamins are also required for skeletal and bone health. So not the focus of what we've discussed, but they are in the bolus because they are important in terms of the roles they have in the body in these physiological processes, but they are less likely to be in shortfall than other trace elements. So I'm just going to go through some trial data that we've got that shows boluses and how they're linked to animal performance, with the emphasis on transition. So the first study that I'm going to show you used 60 dairy farms in the Netherlands. So it's a fairly basic study where they took 60 dairy farms, placed 20 farms in each group, with cows either receiving boluses, mineral powder, or no supplementation. They then went on to measure different parameters, so things like incidence of stillbirths, mastitis, afterbirth problems, return to service, and simply compared them across the three groups. So one, what happens if we provide it as a mineral powder compared to the control? And then what happens if we provide it as a bolus compared to the powder or compared to the control? So what we can see is that we get an effect on incidence of stillbirths, incidence of mastitis. So there's not a lot of difference between the unsupplemented animals and the mineral powder, but there is a big difference between those animals that were unsupplemented and those that got a bolus. I mean, there could be lots of reasons for this. It could be that the intake of the mineral powder was poor because it was unpalatable. But what we can see is if we can control the release of trace elements so that we know that the animal is getting the right amount of trace element every day via a bolus, we can see a performance improvement on the farm. So we can lower the number of stillbirths, we can lower the incidence of mastitis, all of which is going to have a positive effect on that cow's performance in the next lactation. So we see a similar result in terms of afterbirth problems, in terms of returns to service, except from in this one, we do get a little bit of a response with the mineral powder, and then we get a response that's even further with the bolus. So controlling the intake of those minerals has improved the performance of the animals on this trial. So a second study, this was a study that was actually conducted in Belarus. So these boluses that I've talked about tonight, we sell globally. So all over Europe, we sell in South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, South America. So this was a study that was conducted in Belarus. Again, a fairly simple study comparing two groups of cows, those administered with oil trace and simply those not supplemented. And basically incidence of disease was recorded daily up to 2 months post-calving, and reduced for boluses cows compared to unsupplemented controls. So if we have a look at the data, it looks something like this. We get a response in retained placentas, in endometritis, by optimizing the trace element status of these animals. So by providing them with a bolus that releases the same amount of trace elements every day to optimize their trace element status, enable them to be more resilient, to optimize their immune system, to have an antioxidant function, lots of different things that these trace elements do in the body. And then the final trial looks at milk quality. So milk quality was compared between 30 pairs of cows, where one member of the pair was administered 2 boluses and the other was left unsupplemented. And what we'll see when we look at the data in a second is that the bolus significantly reduced somatic cell count, and therefore antibiotic use was lowered compared to unsupplemented cows. So we've got a somatic cell count on the bolus in the first month of lactation of 70 on the bolus, and then unsupplemented 225, and therefore less cows given antibiotics. So the data shown in these studies shows how important trace elements are for transition cows. So all the roles that a trace element has in the body's physiological processes, in the body's immune response, are all really important, and they're highlighted at points where we stress that animal. So points like the transition stage in dairy cows. Really important that we get the status right there to enable the animal to perform. What the data shows us is how effective boluses are at supplying trace elements to improve transition cow health and productivity, and making sure that we're meeting the targets that we feel that a farmer is looking for if he's going to supplement with trace elements. So an easy, simple solution, a solution that once administered will work for 6 months. low maintenance. Once it's in, it's doing all the work for you. It's going to provide trace elements, optimize trace element status to reduce calving problems, production diseases, and prepare that cow for a successful, profitable lactation, optimize her fertility, and aid the cow holding at first service. So thank you very much for your time. If you want to put some questions in the Q&A box, I will hand back over to Stuart.
Thank you very much, Annie. Just maybe before we move on to the questions coming from the floor, Annie, I know you had a couple of questions from participants who couldn't join us tonight, but had emailed you in advance of the presentation that might be of interest to the audience. Do you want to start with one of those?
Yeah, so I think one of the main questions that I've had for tonight, and actually that I talk to vets about regularly, is when do you measure trace element status and how do you measure it? So if we just quickly focus on the two trace elements that I've spoken about tonight, iodine and selenium. So iodine, when we measure iodine, we've got different ways of measuring it. We can measure it using plasma inorganic iodine, or we can measure it using thyroid hormones. What I would recommend is that it's measured using PII, unless we're doing serious investigation and we're trying to find out what is going on with iodine status, something's gone wrong that we can't control. We're just doing an initial look at iodine, I would measure PII, and PII is a parameter that responds immediately. So as soon as you start supplementing iodine, within about 2 days, you should see an increase in the plasma inorganic status. So when it comes to measuring in a transition cow, it doesn't matter too much when you measure it, as long as you measure it far enough away from calving that you get time to intervene should you need to. So if that PII result comes back as too low, you've got time to then supplement those animals when you need to. Now with selenium, the variable that we tend to measure is the enzyme glutathione peroxidase. And that's basically the complete opposite of plasma inorganic iodine. It's a long-term measurement of selenium status. And therefore we need to think about what we measure it compared to when we supplement. So if we're measuring whether a supplement has worked, we need to wait 2 or 3 months to see a response that's true in glutathione peroxidase status. If we're measuring it in transition cows, again, we need to measure it far enough away from the point that we can intervene if we need to increase the selenium status of those animals. I hope that makes sense, but if it doesn't, please ask us another question and I'll try and clarify.
Okay, just to kick off with, there's 3 or 4 questions have come through on the questions, and there's also 2 or 3 I think have come through in the chat facility.
just to confuse you, Stuart.
Yeah, I'll try and salvage those in a moment, but if you don't mind, I'll whiz through these ones on the Q&A. Firstly, Annie, direct evidence for a link to calf food diseases like pneumonia from trace element deficiencies?
So I'm not sure that there is a direct link because of all the other things that can potentially cause pneumonia in calves. I would have thought that the environmental conditions that can cause pneumonia would be much more likely. However, having said that, if we have 2 calves in the same environment and one is in shortfall of its trace element status, so it's low in selenium or it's low in iodine, it's low in copper, whichever one we want to pick, or all of them, and then we've got a calf that is in the normal range for those, I would expect the calf in the normal range for trace elements to be more resilient in the same environment to pneumonia. So they both might get pneumonia, but hopefully the one that has the optimized trace element status is able to cope with it better and fight it better, or in extreme cases, hopefully doesn't get it at all because its immune system kicks in to remove the pathogen quicker. In terms of direct link, I'd have to look if there's a paper that has looked at directly linking trace elements with pneumonia.
Okay, thanks, Annie. Well, hopefully, if there's anything we can uncover in that, we can get back to with a more in-depth answer if you find anything. Second question: is there any issue with bolus plus full mineral supplementation for the whole dry period?
Short answer, possibly yes. So it depends on the minerals we're talking about. So the boluses that we're talking about are supplying trace elements and vitamins. They are not supplying macro minerals. So if we're talking things like magnesium, potassium, sodium, calcium, they're not going to be supplied in a bolus. What you need to be careful of, if say you are supplying a bagged mineral as it is, so full mineral supplementation into that dry cow ration, and then you're going to put a bolus in on top, you need to be careful that you're not going to overdo them on copper. So you've got then copper supplementation coming from two sources and potentially then having a negative effect because they're getting too much copper in the ration. And then if we think about it as sort of a scale, the next one down that I would look for on that is that we're not over supplementing selenium. So it's not a straightforward yes or no. It's a potentially. We need to look into a bit more detail as to what that mineral supplementation is supplying, what the bolus is supplying, and what the overall supply in the diet is.
Okay, thank you, Anne. I hope that helps answer the question. Now, forgive my lack of knowledge in terms of pronunciation of these things, but the next question is: has there been any further development in the knowledge of pathogenesis of chondrohydroplasia in newborn kids?
I don't think there has, to be honest. I haven't seen any recent research on it. So I don't think that there has been any further development in terms of its pathogenesis. As far as I know, again, I stand to be corrected on that if somebody's seen a paper that I have not.
Okay, thanks, Annie. If you have high yielding dairy cows getting 3 to 4 tons of concentrate, is there not a risk of copper toxicity by adding a bolus to the mix?
Absolutely, yes, is the answer. So that goes back to what I've just talked about, is we need to look at the amount of mineral going into the diet as a whole. So how much is going into the lactating diet, how much is going into the dry cow diet, what is the copper status of these cows going to be? I mean, with that in mind, we do a bolus that doesn't have copper in it for that exact situation. Or if we sort of did a mineral audit of the farm and said, no, actually, if we put this bolus in, this cow is going to be an excessive copper supply, then we do a bolus that doesn't have the copper in it for that reason. And I would always encourage anybody that is going to be using boluses for the first time, or any sort of mineral supplementation, drenches, injectables, a bucket, whatever it may be, that they look at every single input in terms of copper to that herd of animals and make sure that they're not going to overdo it, because even if it doesn't have sort of a lethal effect, it will have a detrimental effect on the performance of those animals. So again, it's a yes or a no. It depends what's in your concentrate, it depends what's in the rest of the ration, but it's definitely worth considering whether adding more copper into the mix is the right thing to do.
Thank you, Ellie. Probably tied along with that is, what tests do you recommend for monitoring, i.e. blood tests, soil analysis, forage analysis? Which is okay.
So they blood test, soil analysis, forage analysis, for me, have different functions, and they all have advantages and disadvantages. I mean, in an ideal world, I would love to say to a farmer, do all of them. But realistically, no one's going to do that. It's too expensive. So we need to pick which ones are going to work best. Now, what blood tests do is they offer you a snapshot in time of where that animal is at the moment. So in terms of its iodine status, what is its iodine status on this day when we're measuring it? Now, the drawback there is they don't tell us, actually, you know what, these cows are being rotationally grazed, and the next field they're going on to for the next 21-day rotation actually is really low in iodine, and their iodine is going to drop as soon as they go on to that, and we may see an effect on performance. So blood tests are great, but we must always remember that they only offer us a snapshot in time. Soil analysis is useful if we're looking to change the long-term picture of the farm. So where I've got farms, so I get out on farm a bit, but particularly to people that have got ongoing trace element mineral issues. I've got one farmer, and I just say, and he's actually sheep, that can't graze a particular field. As soon as they graze it, their cobalt status just drops, the lambs stop performing, and it's just a disaster. So what we've said at the moment is just don't graze that. Now, if I wanted to improve the situation and the farmer was on board with that, I would be looking to do soil analysis to find out what's going on there. But I would say soil analysis is useful as a long-term picture. So what is going to happen? What can we do on this farm in the next few years? Not if we're having problems right in that immediate time. And then finally, forage analysis. You get a full mineral forage analysis. That is useful because it tells us what mineral is on offer to that animal. So what could its intake be? But it also tells us antagonists that are present in the forage. So particularly when we're looking at things like copper, it's going to tell us sulfur, molybdenum, iron content, and give us an indication of what the ability is to absorb copper out of that diet. So if it was soil analysis or forage analysis, I would go forage analysis because that's what's in front of the animal. If we want to look at blood tests, remember they're a snapshot in time. For iodine, I would measure PII. For selenium, I would measure glutathione peroxidase. For copper, I would prepare people to look at liver copper status, particularly in cows, to look at whether they're being under supplemented. For cobalt, you can look at things like serum B12s, but again, I would only encourage that to be done in sheep. I don't think it's very accurate in cattle. Yeah, they would be the main ones that I think we would be looking at.
Okay, try and keep zipping through these, just mindful of time.
Yeah.
Some of it might be duplication, Annie, in terms of answering here. If in a well-balanced dairy ration is fed, is further supplementation necessary? Again, is there any risk of copper toxicity, and have you any comments on trace element drenches and injections?
Okay, I'll try and answer this one fairly quickly. So if the dairy ration is balanced completely for minerals, then further supplementation is not necessary. That would be unusual. Most rations are balanced up, energy, protein, potentially now looking at amino acids, but minerals tend to be fairly low on the agenda. There could potentially be risk of copper toxicity, which I think kind of covered earlier. Trace elements, drenches, and injections. So in terms of my comments on those, drenches are great. They work well, providing you use them often. So one of the things I haven't mentioned tonight is quite a lot of the trace elements that we often find in shortfall. So if we go back to one of the common ones, iodine, animal can't store iodine. So if you don't provide her with iodine every day, she has no method of storing it in her body, and therefore it isn't there. So a drench will work providing you administer that drench regularly. Injectables do work. Injectables kind of maybe fall in between drenches and boluses in terms of how long they work for. But no, I don't have an issue with people using injectables as long as they're used properly. They tend to be more of sort of firefighting method and potentially more expensive than something like a bolus as well.
Okay, thank you, Annie. And maybe a topical one for the months ahead, depending on the weather. It's tepid in sheep during a week of cold weather last March. Have you any comments on the epidemiology on what is available, the availability of magnesium boluses are this year?
Yep, so we see different incidences of tetany every year, partially, like you say, affected by the weather, affected by the growth of the grass and how much magnesium is available in the grass, and then the intake of that grass by the animal. In terms of what's available in magnesium boluses, what we would have available is our rumble sheep magnesium bolus, which is a bolus that acts for 21 days and supplies that animal with the magnesium that it needs.
Okay, thank you. What kind of nervous dysfunction problems can a newborn calf get when copper is lacking? And is there anything specific you see?
So nowhere near as specific as sheep. So when we get problems in newborn lambs that are caused by copper, we obviously get sway back. We get that incomplete myelination of the spinal cord, which gives us the obvious clinical signs of sway back. With calves, because they myelinate their spine throughout pregnancy, rather than just at one single point, the results can be more subtle. So I wouldn't say there was a distinct clinical sign, but anything to do with the nervous system and the development of the nervous system could be to do with the copper that was present for the calf during pregnancy, or also as it develops and grows throughout its life.
Okay. I hope that answers the question. Moving on, could you give any expansion on the importance of zinc as the trace element?
Zinc's an interesting one because zinc kind of gets almost thrown around as it will resolve all cattle lameness problems. And it has a role. It has a role in skin health, foot health. It has a role in the body's immune system, but it is not the be all and end all in terms of solving lameness in cattle. In fact, it's actually quite rare to find a herd where, when measured, zinc status is low. So I would say, in terms of its importance, if we're ranking it with other trace elements that we've spoken about tonight, its importance in the body is high. It's needed for lots and lots of physiological processes, but its likelihood to be in shortfall is low. Therefore, its emphasis in terms of supplementation is low. If that makes sense.
Okay, I hope that answers the question. What significance should we attach to binders like molybdenum, and how do we determine how to overcome the problems?
Okay, significant in terms of what significance. So in terms of, if we specifically talk about copper here, about 95% of incidents of copper deficiency are secondary copper deficiency caused by antagonists, so caused by either molybdenum, sulfur, and iron, or a combination of all three, or a combination of two of them potentially. So in terms of their effect on the copper status of animals, it is significant. How do we determine how to overcome the problems? We need to measure, basically. So we need to do that forage analysis. So when you take a forage analysis, it will tell you what the copper content of the forage is. It will also tell you the value that the antagonists are in the forage. And then from that, it will calculate the available copper. And if you look on your forage analysis, there'll be a bar that says something along the lines of available copper. They all report it slightly differently. And that tells us what the copper is that's going to be able to be absorbed by the animal, and therefore what its likely copper status is. If we take that further and we want to measure the effect of molybdenum, we can look at it in bloods. So we can look at things like plasma copper to ceruloplasmin ratio. We can look at plasma molybdenum concentrations, and they can give us an indication of what effect molybdenum would be having. But on most farms, I would say the go-to would be forage analysis, see what's there, what is on offer to the animal, available to the animal, and therefore what can we do about it that way.
Okay, thank you. If farmers are feeding like mycotoxin binders, can this have an effect on the availability of minerals?
That is going to have to be an I don't know. I'm not sure on that one. That is a question no one's ever asked me, but I'll look it up. I'll find somebody who does know.
Okay, we'll hopefully get back to you on that one then. Thank you. Apologies for that. Are there any issues with leaching, etc., during storage of bagged minerals that you know of, Annie?
No, unless the bag gets wet. So some of the minerals that we're going to supplement are water soluble. So if the bag gets wet for any reasons, then you might get leaching. But I can't see any other reason why they would leach during storage. Vitamins will degrade over time. So that's in any situation, bagged mineral, boluses, forage, any vitamin sat there will degrade over time. But in terms of leaching, I wouldn't have thought so.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to check copper levels, what type of sampling do you recommend? As plasma copper assay has limitations, do you recommend the Nottingham reaction analysis or liver biopsies?
I mean, in an ideal world, what I'd love to see people doing both. But if I had to pick one, liver biopsy tells you exactly how much copper that animal has stored. So it tells us exactly how much is available for the animal to homeostatically control its blood. It tells us whether we're at risk of toxicity. It tells us whether we're at risk of deficiency. So if I had to pick one, I would do liver biopsies, or sometimes in sheep, what I would recommend is that they, if they've got any cull animals, that they take the liver of the cull animals and check what their copper status is in the liver.
I think I've found these questions. Apologies to anyone that can't manage to catch. We've probably touched on this. What's your opinion on injectable forms of minerals such as multimin? Probably touched on that. What?
Yeah, multimin works. It's obviously an injectable. It can be fairly expensive, but in terms of its efficacy, it works. But it's just a matter of how long it works for. There are other supplementation methods that will work for longer.
Okay. And I find it hard to imagine that the bolus dissolves evenly over such a long period of time. What's the technology behind this? And does a change in feeding, especially between grass and silage, not change the speed the bolus dissolves?
Okay, so that's depends on the type of boluses. So that I'll only talk about the boluses that Agrimin produce, which are eroding boluses. So how the boluses work is basically a tablet of the minerals in a ballast, so a powder that is compressed at a very specific rate to produce a bolus. Now, what that bolus then does is it gets coated in a resin coating, and when it goes into the animal, it sits in their reticulum, and the two boluses erode against each other over time at a very specific rate. Now, what we do is we have a herd of fistulates out in New Zealand, so we have 16, and we put boluses regularly into those animals so that we can make sure the release rate of the bolus is exactly what we say it is. So we know what the release rate of that bolus is going to be. There will be slight changes on different feed, but they are minimal because that bolus is sitting in the reticulum, it's not in the rumen. So the dietary changes don't massively impact on the rate of erosion. So it's eroding, it's not dissolving. But if you've got any more questions on sort of the mechanism of how they work, I'm sure that we can put something together and send it out.
Okay, Thank you very much, Annie. From what I can see, that probably takes us up towards the end of our time slot. We've had one more question pop in, which is basically, is there any problem giving suck cows 2 boluses 6 weeks pre-calving and then 2 more pre-breeding, i.e. 6 weeks post-calving?
Yes. So what we've got to be careful of is it all goes back to this: are we oversupplying, undersupplying? What are we doing? And there is a potential that if we've only got boluses, which is essentially 12 weeks apart, then we are oversupplying trace elements. There are some trace elements that we're more worried about that than others. I mean, people that know me are going to go, she's on about copper again. But we need to think about, are we going to oversupply that cow with copper? The other thing, in terms of if we have boluses significantly overlapping, I'm not saying that people don't have them overlapping at all, because it depends what fits in with their production system. But if they're significantly overlapping like that, they're eroding boluses. You've then got more objects in the reticulum. All boluses will erode faster, and the boluses won't last as long as they should. So that is not ideal. We could have a discussion about when would be the best time to bolus, when else to fit it in the production system. But I would suggest that that was probably not a good idea.
Okay, thank you. Well, just conscious of time, if anyone has any other burning questions, if they want to email Annie or myself immediately after the presentation, or if anyone unfortunately missed it or had to drop out or anything like that for various reasons, again, we hope to be able to email a recorded version of the presentation to people. Or if we can help any other way, please feel free to get in touch with us. Details are on the website, contact details for myself or Annie. And I think all remains for me to do is to thank everyone for joining in tonight. Thank those who asked the questions, and everyone who was patient enough to listen to us, and to Vet NI for helping us with getting the word out about tonight's event. And hopefully we can run something similar again in the near future. And thank everyone for their attendance. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.